Where does the story of South Asians in the UK start?
South Asians have actually been present in Britain for over 400 years. We're here because you were there. In the mills of Lancashire, in the factories of Southall and Luton and all of these places, they need migrant workers. 1909, one of the students, Madan Lal Dhingra, he assassinates a senior British official. I met very wealthy Asian people who are doing much better than white working class people in my town. Firstly, Malcolm X had a massive influence on Asians. Self-defense is no offense. That we will fight the fascists. If you come to our neighborhood, who's this pool of blood? What's this? And you say it's just Asian blood.
Hi Taj, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, a lot of South Asians like myself, we trace our history in the UK to the 1960s and 70s. My granddad came over in the 1960s. I think your granddad also came over in the 1960s. But the history of South Asians in Britain stretches far longer than that. So I was wondering, where does the story of South Asians in the UK start?
So South Asians have actually been present in Britain for over 400 years.
Wow.
And you have to understand the history of empire and colonialism to understand the South Asian presence. There's a great intellectual called Sivanandan who says, we're here because you were there. And he's referring to the British Empire. Britain went and colonized the Indian subcontinent and they brought back people with them. So as early as the 1600s, you actually had parish records of young Indians. There was a story of a young Indian boy who was baptized. And there's a great historian called Rosina Visram who's chronicled some of these early tales of South Asians in Britain. So you had servants coming to Britain. You had a group of young women called ayahs who were servants in the aristocratic households. So in parts of Scotland and other areas where you had people who travelled to the subcontinent, they would bring back Indians with them. And it was almost seen as a status symbol because Orientalism was a big thing. People were very interested and fascinated by the East. And so it was a status symbol to have people from the Indian subcontinent working in your household. You also had seafarers working on the British ships. They were referred to as lascars. And these seafarers came not just from the subcontinent, but from parts of Arabia, Africa, the West Indies, China. A lot of the sailors from Britain who arrived in the subcontinent, some of them would die on the voyage. They couldn't survive the journey. Some of them would stay in the subcontinent. So they needed people to come back with them when they were transporting goods. So they started recruiting people from parts of Gujarat. You had people from Bengal, even from Azad Kashmir and Mirpuri. You had people working on the ships. They were mistreated on the ships. A lot of them were working. There was this colonial stereotype of South Asians that they could withstand extreme heat. So they would be shoveling coal into the steamships. Some of them would die on the voyages. Some of them would be tortured so much that they would jump overboard. And so you also had seafarers who actually jumped ship when they were in Britain. And sometimes you would have the steamship companies would say to the sailors that we are no longer responsible for you. And so some of them were made homeless on the streets of London. And there's a Times article, I think, from the early 1800s, where they talk about 40 sons of India found dead on the streets of London, cold, shivering. You can imagine at the time, they weren't going to get jobs in Britain. They were resorting to things like begging, sweeping the streets, trying to sell goods where they could. And that is the story of the earliest South Asians in Britain. And then when the numbers started to increase, when you had the Napoleonic Wars and World War One, they needed more seafarers. And so what you start to have is the earliest South Asian communities developing in the port cities: Liverpool, Cardiff, Glasgow, South Shields, Southampton. You wouldn't think of these places as areas of South Asian settlement. You usually think of Southall and Bradford and Birmingham, but actually it's the port cities where South Asians were.
Which makes sense because ships are going to be docking into those.
Exactly. And it was a good mix of people as well. They were interacting with African and Chinese sailors as well. And it's really interesting the way people talk about multicultural cities today, you know, no-go zones, areas of high crime. That was the same attitude back then. If you think about Butte Town in Cardiff, where you had Africans and Asians and other seafarers developing one of the first multicultural communities in Britain, it was seen as an area that was known for prostitution and gambling and crime and foreigners. And in the papers, they would talk about places like that in those ways.
And did any of these seafarers, these new migrants, get citizenship and stay in the country, or was it quite transitory?
It was quite transient. I mean, there would be very often they would be deported, repatriated, they used to say back then. A lot of them would be back on the ships. It wasn't an enjoyable experience to be in Britain. You were a foreigner. You were seen as the alien. You weren't given rights. It was very difficult to find housing. They would be living in the barracks, horrible conditions. And you actually had Christian missionaries. I think Joseph Salter was one of them, and he actually detailed some of the stories of these people. He set up homes for some of these people. There was a place called, I think it was a place in East London where he actually gave them shelter, and actually tried to teach them English and things like that, and tried to convert them to Christianity. But I think it was only sort of World War One and World War Two where the numbers started to increase, and some of them are jumping ship and trying to find alternative employment. So in the 1920s, you have Bengalis in the East End developing some of the first restaurants and cafes in East London.
Wow. So is it like Brick Lane in the 1920s?
Yeah, yeah. You had a guy called Ayub Ali Master, and he was called Master because he was someone who was more educated than the others. And so when it came to filling forms and supporting them, he was the guy that they would turn to. There were certain houses that South Asians owned, and when people would jump ship, they would go to those houses knowing that that was the only place they could seek help. And then you also have, interestingly, some of the South Asians actually developing the lodging homes for the seafarers. And so you see almost a class system developing there. Even on the ships, some of the people exploiting the seafarers, the Lascars, they were known as sarangs, the middlemen, the recruiters, and they would sometimes cheat these people. So even back then, you had different classes of South Asians. You had winners and losers.
So the Sarangs were other South Asians as well.
Yeah, they would be people who would try and recruit them to work for the British companies, and then they would make a cut of recruiting them. And that system led to corruption. You'd sometimes have to bribe the recruiter. And then when they came to Britain, they would often be some of the same people who would set up the lodging homes and charge rent. And so that system allowed for abuse and exploitation.
And what about more educated people from the subcontinent? I've heard stories of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Gandhi, all come to the UK to study. Was they quite like, when did that start, and was that quite important?
Yeah, so you could only qualify as a barrister in places like Bombay with a British qualification. And so that meant that you had students who were more middle class coming to Britain. Some of these students were actually very radical. I mean, we've all heard about Jinnah and Gandhi and these individuals, but there were some individuals who were calling through violent means for independence. And to kind of understand that a bit, it was in Bengal that they introduced the English education system. And they thought that if we introduce the English education system in Calcutta and Bengal, we will create an educated population that will be subservient to the British because it's our education system. What actually happens is people start reading things about liberty and rights
and democracy.
Say, you lot aren't very liberal.
Exactly.
You lot aren't giving us our rights. What's going on here? Why don't you practice what you preach? And that's when we start to see the Indian National Congress developing in the 1870s. But also, you get this Bengal Renaissance. There's this fascination with Bengali literature. You get a rise in nationalism. People saying, you know, we used to have civilization in this country and now we've lost it. And actually, the British are exploiting us. You had the drain theory developing. Dadabhai Naoroji, one of the first British South Asian MPs, he creates this theory basically talking about how Britain drained the wealth of the subcontinent. And when you think about it, just before British colonial rule, the Indian subcontinent share of the world economy was 23%.
Yeah.
When they left, it was 3%. When you think about the textile industry, before Britain colonized the subcontinent, India's textile industry was huge, and they had a historic Indian Ocean trading network. So the Indian subcontinent and various kingdoms and rulers would trade with parts of East Africa, with the Arabs as well. Before that, you know, thousands of years ago, you had the Indus Valley civilization. You know, they had sometimes I think they had. I think they introduced the drainage system, one of the first sanitation systems in the world. And so people are starting to question their own place in the world, their own identity, trying to understand their own history. In 1857, you have the Indian Mutiny. For the Indians, it was known as the Uprising, where they rebelling against British rule, and that's brutally suppressed by the British. There's a lot of violence. So people have these memories of what British rule is like. And the British start clamping down on these Indian revolutionaries and nationalists. If you write certain things, this now we've got the printing press in the subcontinent. If you're agitating against the British, they're going to try and imprison you. There was a wave of assassinations around this time as well. We're talking about the sort of 1870s and 1880s. And there's one guy called Shyamji Krishna Varma. He studied in Britain as well. I think he was one of the first students at Oxford, one of the first South Asians studying there. And he's a wealthy lawyer. He marries into a rich Indian family. I think he marries the daughter of a wealthy cotton mill owner. And he supports the independence struggle. And he realizes that he's at risk. He could be imprisoned in the subcontinent. So he actually moves to Britain, to Muswell Hill, and he starts to agitate for independence from North London. And he actually decides that one thing he could do in the service of the struggle is to actually fund scholarships for Indian students on the basis that they refuse to work for the British. So he buys a place, 65 Cromwell Avenue, in Highgate, and it's known as India House, and it's set up in 1904. And he starts bringing in Indian students, and he starts teaching them about revolutionary nationalism. He starts advocating for freedom, and he lectures them. He starts his own publication called the Indian Sociologist as well, again agitating for independence. He develops links with Egyptian nationalists, Irish Republicans, suffragettes, socialists, and this place, India House, becomes even more radical, because soon you have a guy called Savarkar who arrives at India House, and he's a very interesting figure. Savarkar, young firebrand, arrives as a student, and he starts saying, well, we need to start adopting violent means for the struggle for independence.
Where was he inspired from that?
So he grew up in India at a time where there was a history of sort of assassinations against British rule, and he had this fascination with historic Hindu culture. Again, he was a product of his time. He'd seen what the British authorities were doing in the subcontinent, and as a young man, he'd tried to organize a secret society in his local college in India. And so he arrives in Britain, I think it was in 1906, and he almost takes leadership of India House. And so he's telling them that we need to start carrying out assassinations in Britain at the very heart of empire. And they start smuggling weapons into the Indian subcontinent from North London. In 1906, you've got Indian students doing these things. They had a bomb-making workshop in the garden, and all of this is documented in the British State Surveillance Files, which you can find in the British Library in the Asian and African reading rooms. They had an entire collection called the India Office Records. So the British authorities are onto these students, saying these guys are a threat. They also had their own makeshift, I think, shooting range in the garden installed, and again, it alarmed the British authorities. They were doing shooting practice at a court, at a range on Tottenham Court Road, I believe. And in 1909, one of the students, Madan Lal Dhingra, he assassinates a senior British official. So you have an assassination from Indian students in 1909. And
in the name of independence.
In the name of independence.
Yeah.
So you've got Indians who aren't just here as students, but who are revolutionaries in Britain. And that wasn't the first assassination. In 1938, there's another guy called Udham Singh who assassinates the former Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer. And that was in revenge for the Amritsar massacre of 1919 in Punjab. So not only do you have a historic South Asian presence here, you also have a history of South Asian radicals and revolutionaries in Britain as well.
And what role did these revolutionaries play in Indian independence?
Well, I think the first thing to say is their role is downplayed. We talk a lot about Gandhi and Jinnah and the Congress Party, and it's really interesting. The individual I mentioned earlier, Savarkar, he is actually the founding ideologue of the Hindu far right. So when he started out, he was an anti-imperialist. He was quite proud of Hindu culture, but his anti-imperialism morphs into a more exclusionary nationalism, which starts to say it wasn't just the British who invaded us, it was the Mughals and the Muslims, and they're not actually indigenous. And it's interesting that he actually gets imprisoned by the British in the Andaman Islands, and he's signing mercy petitions saying, I won't agitate against the British if you let me go free. And then lo and behold, suddenly he is an anti-Muslim Hindu far-right nationalist. And in India today, people look up to people like Savarkar. He's seen as this great revolutionary.
The forefather of the BJP.
Exactly. But there's others that the BJP and the Hindu far-right today will claim as their own, who are actually much more secular. like Shyamji Krishnavarma, who I spoke about earlier. He actually gave out scholarships in the name of Mughal emperors. He worked with Muslim and Sikhs as well. He actually attended meetings of Muslims in London as well. And so I think, sort of early 20th century, the Indian independence struggle is quite a secular movement. We're talking about cross religion, there wasn't much of a difference in terms of caste or religion. But then in sort of the 20s and 30s, it becomes a bit more of a divided struggle where we're talking about, Pakistan, the concept of Pakistan. Hindu nationalism becomes a thing. In terms of the role of these individuals, I think certainly there was this concept of the extremists and the moderates, and even the Indian National Congress, there was a divide within that over what methods we adopt. Gandhi was someone who was heavily criticized by many of the early revolutionaries because at first many of these people were saying we want a more just British rule. They weren't saying we want independence, they were saying we want a better system. And that was a very liberal mindset. And these revolutionaries were pushing and saying, no, we need to boycott British cloth, we need self-sufficiency. We're going to, I think they burnt British cloth actually at one point. And then, of course, you had the partition of Bengal around the early 1900s. That created a massive revolutionary movement there as well. And they were impacting British industry by boycotting British products, British cloth, and burning their products, and even advocating the social boycott of people who use British products. So they had a massive impact on British industry. So they did play a role. It's interesting that in the United States and Canada, you had a migration of Punjabi farmers moving there. There was always migration, by the way, across the empire during colonial rule, because, as I said earlier, there were winners and losers. When the British introduced the land tenure system, you had the zamindars, who were the landowners, and so you had they created this kind of class structure where you had the landlords, and then you had people who used to own land who suddenly become peasants, landless laborers, and they end up in debt to some of these people. And it was those people who would join, migrants abroad, and they would get involved in the indentured servitude system.
Do you mind explaining a bit more about what indentured servitude is?
Yeah, indentured servitude. So when slavery was abolished, in many of these colonies, they still had plantations and they wanted this cheap supply of labor. And so they would encourage migrants from the subcontinent to work. So in Mauritius, they had a lot of Indian migrants arriving there, in parts of the West Indies, in Trinidad as well. And these people were treated horribly. They were often cheated. They were often misled into what they thought would be great employment. I mean, you still have that system today in terms of what migrants are told they expect and what
they receive,
what the reality is. But that had a massive impact. But also in the United States, you had Punjabis who moved there to work in the logging camps, who worked on the Pacific coast as well, who worked on the railway tracks. They faced horrible racism as well as the Chinese. But it's interesting that in the United States, Punjabis actually formed a movement called the Ghadar Party. Ghadar meant mutiny. And again, it was one individual from India House that I was talking about earlier. He actually moved to the United States, and he actually encouraged them to adopt similar sort of tactics in terms of assassinations. And so the Ghadar Party in the United States were actually advocating for revolution. And because a lot of the British army recruited from Punjab, they wanted a mutiny within the ranks, and it ultimately was unsuccessful. I think before the First World War, they'd encouraged a mutiny, and very few of them actually took part, and many of them got arrested. But it just goes to show the transnational dimensions of the independence struggle, how cosmopolitan it was, how much of it was influenced by interactions with other diasporas. So in the United States, you had a massive Irish diaspora. There was a paper in New York called the Gaelic American. They were frequently talking about the independence struggle. They frequently referenced the activities of Indian revolutionaries as well. A lot of the tactics that were used, the very concept of the Indian Home Rule League movement came from the Irish. Boycott campaigns, hunger strikes, all of these tactics they were learning from others engaged in similar struggle.
Wow. Fast forwarding to the 1960s, the 1970s. Now, all of this migration, the South Asian migration to the UK wasn't monolithic. different groups had different push and pull factors. Considering we're both British Mirpuris and we've got an adopted Mirpuri here for today, I was wondering if you could go a bit more into the story of what brought British Mirpuris to the UK.
So initially, you had Mirpuris recruited to work on the ships as the Lascars. So there was an existing migration much earlier. I think in the post-war period, again, you have to understand who Mirpuris are. They are people from peasant farming communities, from a very rural society where people work their land and work as farmers.
Subsistence farming.
Exactly.
Living off the land.
Exactly. And then we have the construction of the Mangla Dam, one of the biggest, dams in Azad Kashmir. My own ancestral village is submerged because of the construction of this dam, and a lot of people have a similar story. I think 280 villages were submerged when they built this dam in the post-war period, and that meant there was more of an incentive to seek opportunity elsewhere. I think a lot of people were compensated, so you suddenly have more money. Some people are getting work visas, but you also have to understand what's happening in Britain at this time. In Britain, you have labour shortages in many industries. We're also expanding the economy as well, just after the Second World War. So in the mills of Lancashire, Yorkshire, in the foundries of the West Midlands, in the factories of Southall and Luton and all of these places, they need migrant workers. And so they're actively trying to recruit workers. And you have this chain migration developing. And it was very similar with parts of Punjab. So in Southall, for instance, there was the Wolves Rubber Factory. And this factory, the guy who ran it, had worked in India as a soldier, and he'd met Punjabis, and he'd encouraged them to actually work at this one factory in Southall. And most of the Punjabis at the time were living in places like Aldgate, East London, or parts of Coventry and Birmingham. And the ones who lived in Aldgate were travelling to work at this one factory in Southall. And the commute was so long, the hours were long, they realised it wasn't going to work. And Southall was the cheapest area to live in, and so they moved. And so what you know as Southall today is the product of this factory, encouraging chain migration, and suddenly they're expanding as a community. And it's the same when you think about Bradford and Birmingham as well. It's worth pointing out that we had a much earlier migration of people from predominantly Punjab, is fair to say, in the 20s and 30s in many of these areas that we consider, industrial towns and cities. So earlier I was talking about the seafarers who worked on the ships. In the 1920s and 30s, you have the Great Depression, and you have an increase in migrants from Punjab who worked as what we call peddlers, door-to-door salespeople. And when the Second World War broke out, suddenly they're more willing to accept people working in factories because they have a labour shortage. And so it was that existing pattern of migration to parts of Birmingham and Coventry and Bradford that encouraged others to go to those places because they'd seen Asians working there, if that makes sense. So we actually had the establishment of a group called the Indian Workers Association in Coventry in 1938. And it was predominantly Punjabi Sikhs, but you also had Muslims. And they were actively representing South Asians in these different industries, but also agitating for independence. And just by reading some of the history about this group, you can see that you had a Muslim presence in parts of Bradford and Birmingham and Coventry as well. And slowly that starts to expand. And it's interesting, in those early sort of 1950s and 60s, migrants went wherever the work was. And it's similar to the white working class of Britain. The community was built around industry. When I think about Luton, Bury Park, which is seen as the heart of the Asian community, it's where our football ground is as well. The terrace houses that are predominantly occupied by Asians were built for Irish and Scottish migrants who worked in the nearby industries. And so a lot of the areas that South Asians migrated to already had a history of migration. It was Irish, West Indians, Jewish people, Scottish people, also from parts of the country where there were economic depression. So parts of Durham as well, they were moving to places in like Southall as well. So our history is tied to that history of industry as well. And when I think about Mirpuris and people from Azad Kashmir, again, it was the pooling of resources that enabled migration to happen. So people would all chip in to allow one family member to migrate to, and it was about supporting each other. So there was a lot of communal living. One 3-bedroom house, you'd have 20 people in there. They would take shifts on the beds. That was, my dad would tell me these stories. You'd have, 3, 4 mattresses in one room because there was a lot of housing discrimination. But that also meant you had a very tight knit community. Everyone knew each other. Everyone would pool their resources together. If there was any form of political activity or organizing, you couldn't escape it. It's happening in your front room.
Yeah. And I think another unique thing about the Mirpuri migration is because we're from Kashmir, and as we know, the status of Kashmir in Pakistan is it isn't part of Pakistan, it's an autonomous region. These guys didn't have passports. And so when the initial migration was happening, they obviously didn't have passports. And it took Pakistani Prime Minister Bhutto, he literally he had to give these guys basically passports, and he had to make like a change in legislation to allow that migration to happen, which I think is quite distinct for the Mirpuri migration to the UK.
And it's interesting, I think, towards the sort of late 60s, early 70s, in East Africa, you have the policy of Africanization. So Idi Amin says to South Asians in Uganda, just to give you a bit of context here, you had the indentured servitude that I was talking about earlier in parts of East Africa as well. So you had South Asians migrating, a lot of them from Gujarat to East Africa. But in sort of the 20th century, you also start to get a middle class, teachers, wealthy businessmen. They start to move into East Africa. And when you have this Africanization policy, where post-independence African leaders are saying, we think you have way too much power in our country, you start to have discrimination against Asians, and a lot of them are forced out, and some of them arrive in Britain. So a lot of these new migrants in the sort of 70s are coming from middle class origins. They have education, they have an understanding of English. But it's interesting that when they arrive in Britain, their qualifications are not recognized. So they're working on the same factory floors as the Mirpuris and the Punjabis. But it's fair to say that just having that knowledge of the English education system actually helps massively. And when we talk about employment outcomes and educational outcomes and what we consider the good immigrant, is worth understanding the importance of origin as well.
Guys, I hope you're enjoying our discussion with Taj so far. If you want to help us get more amazing guests like him, please like, subscribe, and share with all your friends and family. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get back to it.
Yeah, let's go into this a bit deeper because I think it's quite interesting. So today in Britain, you have different migrant groups, and the success of them is quite it's all over the place. So especially when it comes to British Mirpuris, they have the lowest incomes, lowest employability rates, they have the lowest educational outcomes, along with British Bengalis. But then you look at our colonial cousins, the Indians, just like literally miles across in Pakistan. British Indians are one of the most successful migrant communities. They have some of the highest employability, highest income rates. What role does migration tell in understanding the story today? So today, us two as British Mirpuris, and then you could just find two kind of examples of British Indians. How significant is the role of migration to explain that difference today?
I think when I think about my own family, in our village at the moment, the school is really bad. It's not going to get you any sort of real employment. We come from rural farming communities, so we never had this concept of higher education. So many of our people, when they came in the 60s and 70s, they're working in the factories, they're working long shifts, they're facing racism on the streets, housing discrimination. They're congregating in some of the worst parts of the country, the decaying inner cities, right? So they're already living in areas that are suffering economic damage, where you have less opportunity. And then when you think about the generation that comes after them, you're the children of factory workers, you're the children of taxi drivers. I'm talking sort of more 90s and 2000s. When your parents are working long hours to provide for you, they're not investing as much in terms of employment and education.
And when they're illiterate, a lot of Mirpuris who came over were illiterate. They didn't speak the language compared to the ones who came from Kenya, or the ones who came from the cities of India and Pakistan.
So that makes a huge difference. If your parents are educated or they have a degree, they're going to be able to understand that system. They're going to be able to give you careers advice. Who's giving Mirpuris careers advice? Even in some of the colleges and schools, they never really had that. The concept of going to university was very alien to a lot of people. And even now, when we think about universities, my experience going to Russell Group University, went to Warwick, how many Mirpuris did I meet? Very few. Even though Mirpuris make up the vast majority of Pakistanis in the UK, Very few of them at Russell Group universities, very few of them becoming doctors and lawyers. And people used to say, your community has a problem. Mirpuris have a problem. Why aren't you guys doing well? You guys have been here for so many years. But there is an ignorance about that history, right? Of people working in areas that have been impacted by deindustrialization. My dad worked at the Vauxhall factory. Interesting story about my dad. He was one of the first people in his generation to go to university. So he went to Bradford University, studied chemical engineering, couldn't find a job. He believes that racism in the jobs market played a massive role in that. He really struggled financially, and he ended up in a factory with all the other people he grew up with. He was made redundant in 2002. Then he works as a cabbie. And so his outcome is going to be very different to someone like Rishi Sunak, where you're coming here as the child of middle-class migrants, and you have more capital. You're living in a nice part of the country. Of course, that makes a difference. Are you telling me if the children of doctors and lawyers grew up in parts of West London, where you're closer to the city, do you not think they're going to have different outcomes to a Mirpuri in Bradford?
Nah, 100%, I agree.
Yeah. So Taj, obviously we've looked a bit at the history of the Mirpuri community, like sort of why you have a lot of the challenges that you guys have today. What does the community look like today? Are things starting to improve? Is there like an upward trajectory, or are a lot of these issues kind of baked in and a lot harder to get rid of?
It's complex. I think definitely in terms of business, when I think about Mirpuris that I know in Luton and other places, people that didn't go to university, some of them ended up working for their parents who might have owned a garage or a shop and things like that, and have done well financially. But in terms of representation in journalism, politics, law, I think there's a real problem here. I don't think we're doing enough in terms of mentorship for young people. And what I've learned navigating journalism and other places is that stuff really matters, networks and things like that. Again, when we talk about Mirpuris, how often do we talk about class? We talk about the white working class.
I just want to pause on that because we don't talk about Mirpuris, we talk about Pakistanis, and in that there's a massive conflation.
Yeah.
In that when you talk broadly about Asians, you're
Yeah.
grouping all of them together.
Yeah.
So let's say you have 10 journalists and 9 of them are rich Punjabis.
Yeah.
You tick box has been ticked for the BBC. There's no Mirpuri representation there because if you're like from the BBC or you're like a big law firm, you're conflating them all as Asians, and so you can just get some private school kids and you've done the job.
This is
you
a
don't need
big
to
problem.
focus on you don't need to laser focus on Mirpuris or like working class Asians.
This is a huge problem, this concept of BAME, right? It conflates the experience of people which are entirely different. When I went to Warwick, and I'm sure you guys have seen this as well, I met very wealthy Asian people who are doing much better than white working class people in my town. The white working class of Luton are less likely to go to university than Asian working class people, right?
Taj, I've got like a funny story for this. So I went to a law firm and they found out I was Pakistani. And so they were like, wow, we've got this Pakistani community just for you, Akil. I was like, I'm super down. So they take me to a room and there's 2 Pakistanis there. Both of them went to a grammar school, like Karachi Grammar School. Both of them spoke in like a really posh accent. And both of them were talking about skiing in the Alps. So you got me, a kid from state school in Birmingham, 2 of these Pakistanis from Pakistan who are like extremely wealthy and now lawyers in the city. And they're talking about skiing. And essentially, I was just looking at them like, I've got more in common with a white working class person than I do with these 2.
100%.
But for the law firm, they just saw me as Pakistani. And I guess like it was the identity where they were just like, let's group them together and they'll be mentors. And I was like, this is so far from the truth. As in, although they've got the same skin as me, we live like different lives. Like I have way more in common as a working class person in the UK with the white working class than I do with rich South Asians.
But this is the thing that frustrates me. No one's willing to have a nuanced conversation about how inequalities manifest in multiple different ways, right? The Sutton Trust just released some data which found that poorer kids in some parts of the country are much worse off than poorer kids in parts of London, right? And when I looked at the data, Birmingham and Luton, we actually had more opportunity than predominantly white working class areas. And our kids were doing better in the education system. But then we will get screwed over when we look at the dropout rates in the Russell Group universities, much higher for Black and Asian people. When I think about the professional industries, journalism, law, politics, the experience of people from working class backgrounds who also feel alienated by certain cultures, feel like they've got nothing in common. All of these things matter. But, just getting back to that point about race and class, right? imagine one of these people from this grammar school go to a white working class area in Birmingham or Luton and say, you've got white privilege. What do you think that white kid's going to say?
Where is the privilege around me? As in, like,
Yeah.
it's all individual, right? If
Yeah.
you're from a white working class area, single mother living in a council flat, struggling to have bread on the table, you're going to look around and think, what privilege is around me?
And this is why the far right are doing so well, because they're saying, look at these people, they don't understand you. It doesn't mean that white working class people are ignorant to the fact that the experience of a black person in the criminal justice system is different to theirs. I think a white working class person will know what my experience would be like going out to an airport, for instance. They're not ignorant of these things.
Your bag's always going to get searched.
Yeah.
You're always going to be taken aside
Yeah.
as a special guest.
But
You know,
Randomly selected.
the ballot system keeps picking up your name.
I think because we've neglected to talk about class in terms of social mobility, in terms of supporting people, what's that meant is we've allowed the far right to jump on this concept of the white working class, right? The white working class have been abandoned. And my frustration with that is the working class is multiracial and multi-ethnic. You never hear the concept of the black working class or the Asian working class, even though our communities are disproportionately working class. So if we want to improve outcomes in terms of education and employment, we have to be laser focused on where the problem is. If you get 10 privately educated Asians into a corporate law firm, that doesn't mean anything to a working class Mirpuri person in Birmingham or Tower Hamlets or Luton, wherever. And so that's what we need to deal with, is the masses, not individual success, but how are you fixing problems in communities?
Tam, growing up, how many of your problems can you relegate to class and how much to race? And I'll give you an example, right? Growing up, my biggest problem was a class one. It was money in the house. I grew up poor, and that's where the majority of my problems come. Yes, there's an element of race, but I would say it's 90-10. Most of my issues came from being poor, not from being brown. And I do agree, being brown brings issues in the UK, but being poor and brown, that's the double whammy that will screw you. And the stats prove this in that if you're an ethnic minority and you're middle class, your outcomes in life are far better than if you were white working class or brown and working class, obviously. The big crux for me is like income. It's being poor.
Yeah, I don't even like the concept of oppression Olympics, because it's like inequalities will manifest and discrimination and disadvantage will mean different things. So to give you an example, all three of my sisters wear the headscarf. They have all faced racist abuse throughout their lives. When they go to the Lake District, they'll get it. When they're in certain places, they'll get it. And their experience as Muslim women who wear a headscarf would be different to the experience of a Muslim man, right? How will that affect them in terms of networking at events and things like that and knowing people, right? How does your religion and culture prevent you from certain opportunities, from meeting certain people? And I can tell you for a fact that in journalism and in politics, it's not just about what you know, it's about who you know. In fact, it's probably the truth that it's more about who you know than what you know. I've seen people get opportunities based on who they know in an industry. And if you're a Muslim, a South Asian, from parts of like Birmingham or Bradford or Luton or Blackburn or wherever, what is your social network and how does that impact your life chances? I think that matters a lot. So culture in some ways can also have an impact. In terms of how race has impacted me, I mean, I went to a school that was 99% black and Asian. There's only one white guy in my entire year group. Even he was Irish. So I never really mixed with that many white people. I mean, growing up, primary school was a bit more
When was the
mixed.
first time you had a white friend?
Well, very early on. My primary school was more mixed. My road was quite mixed. And no one really cared. Like, we had small gardens. We'd all play on the front garden. We lived on a close. And there was more fascination. We had quite a lot of landlordism. So there was constant churn of people in our neighborhood. But no one really gave a damn kind of thing. And we would all share food when it was like a religious festival and things like that. And it was only race really hit me when I was 11 and we're being told, oh, you can't go into the town centre because the EDL are in town. And you're thinking, EDL?
Oh yeah, you're from Luton. The
Yeah.
famous Tommy Robinson, Andrew Tate, Taj Ali.
Yeah.
Famous trio.
Holy Trinity.
I publicly apologize for what we've produced. But no, like it was, we're being told EDL are in town. So we're like, okay, what's the EDL? Why don't these people like us? So you're being confronted with your identity very early on in your life. You're asking questions. What is this thing? What is Islamophobia? Why are they saying Muslims are terrorists? And I'm thinking of like this old man with a long white beard, the kind of guy to move nettles because it might harm the kids. And he's being depicted as the extreme terrorist. I'm thinking, since when did being religious make you more violent, right? And so we're questioning all of these things and trying to understand it more. That definitely shaped us. We definitely felt more Muslim as a result of Islamophobia and racism, and we embraced identity a lot more. And then we start asking questions of our parents. And my dad would say, certain roads I used to walk through, that you walk through with relative ease, I couldn't walk through because we'd get our heads kicked in. My dad lived one road away from Luton Town Football Club, the stadium, and on a match day, they would stay indoors. They wouldn't go into the garden because Millwall fans, Chelsea fans, others would come in and cause problems. And so racism is a problem. Class is a problem. And I don't think it's useful when we start trying to pit them against each other. We can see how they can intersect. We can understand how it might impact you more in the jobs market. But I'm telling you this, it depends on where you live as well. If you're a Muslim in Belfast today, just go on Google and type in hate crime Belfast. Every single week there is a racist hate crime in Belfast. Every single week. The amount of racist hate crime in the northeast of England, in parts of Wales. If you live in Luton or Bradford or areas where you are the majority, you don't really face racism, right? Because everyone around you is the same colour, and the white people who live next to you have lived with you for so many years. So I think a lot of the time, a lot of our young Asians, they don't really understand it because they've not had to be a minority really and truly.
Yeah, I grew up again similar, like 99% like Muslims, 99% black, Pakistani, Bengali. Like I didn't know what racism like was. Like I've never actually experienced it like properly, like growing up. And then you come to London, super cosmopolitan. Like I didn't really know like what it was.
Yeah. Meanwhile, like, so obviously I grew up in London, but my mum's from Hull, which is like a very sort of white working class place. So growing up, I had that contrast where in London, everything was normal. Then I go to Hull and would experience racism, and I come back.
What was that like in Hull?
That it was very like, so my mum wears a hijab, my grandma wears a hijab, and you'd walk and you get like loads of looks, loads of stares. Sometimes people would say things, sometimes people would shout and stuff. So it was sort of a completely different experience than maybe what the previous generation faced. But Taj, I'm a bit curious in terms of, so we can see from these experiences that the white working class and the Asian working class and the black working class have like a very similar struggle. But why has there sort of been a failure to sort of create that class consciousness there where actually people unite on the basis of socioeconomics? And as we saw with the riots last summer, people are focusing primarily on race, on religion, and dividing in that way.
It's interesting, just to go back to the history a bit. In 1968, Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, right? He was the MP in Wolverhampton. He was a Shadow Defence Secretary. And back then, the Sikhs...
And Keir Starmer's pen pal, apparently.
Yeah.
They shared notes at the right speeches.
We can talk about that. But the Sikhs, there was a Sikh bus driver who wore the turban for the first time on the bus, and he got sacked. And there was a big campaign from the Indian Workers Association saying, we should have the right to wear the turban. When Asians came early on, very few of them wore turbans or grew their beards, and they were quite secular and they would mix more. And that was partly in response to the high levels of racism that they faced. The idea that you're not going to get a job if you wear a turban. You're not going to get a job if you've got a beard. They would wear suits. And so arguably there was more assimilation when they were less in number, right? Is that right, that a Sikh is not allowed to wear a turban? That's the question to ask. When people say, we need to create this kind of national sense of identity, it's very difficult actually in practical terms. And I think a lot of the Islamophobia now is in a similar way, that now that these people are large in number, they're taking liberties in terms of the mosques, in terms of asserting proudly their religious identity. But when I think about the anti-racists who tried to bring communities together, it was very difficult. There was a group in Sheffield called the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, and they organised the physical defence of their community, predominantly young lads in Sheffield, young Asian lads, Muslim, Sikh and Hindu. Back then, there wasn't the kind of tensions that you get today. It was very secular.
The Leicester tensions.
Yeah, it was totally different. They all saw themselves as one. You're getting called Paki regardless of where you're from. And it's funny that they actually organised under the banner of political blackness. Asians were referred to as black people, and West Indians and Africans considered them black as well, because blackness wasn't just about your skin color; it was about your lived experience in Britain.
It was an other.
Yeah,
an other to
so
the white.
Pakistani people would be called the N word, African people would call the P word, and everyone was facing a similar thing. And it's interesting that the Sheffield Asian youth movement were very clued on, and they knew that they were a minority. So they were trying to build bridges with different communities, right? They had this class consciousness back then. And in 1984, we had the miners' strike, right? Predominantly white working class people going on strike. South Asians raised a lot of money to support these white working class communities. In fact, in Birmingham, in Handsworth, Soho Road, the mining lodges used to fight over who gets that patch for the funding, because the black and Asian people in that area were people donating a lot of money. And the Sikh temples, they have this concept of langar. They were giving out food, they were feeding them, and that challenged perceptions. White working class were reading newspapers and seeing Asian invasion, all these Asians are coming over. And then when they're being shafted and they're losing their industry, it's black and Asian people standing with them on a picket line, even though very few of them work in the mines. And there's a story that Mukhtar Dar, one of the members of the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, tells. And it was 5 a.m. and they got a minivan, and they're getting their members to go to Orgreave. Orgreave was an area just outside of Sheffield where you had the miners' picket line, people standing, and there was a lot of police violence at the time as well. So they wanted big numbers out. And so they picked up all their members. There's one guy called Sadiq, and they got pebbles and they threw it on his bedroom window. And Sadiq's not up for it. He's tired. And they're like, Sadiq, come on, man. We've got to stand with the miners. So Sadiq comes and joins them in the minivan. And then when they get to Orgreave, one of the miners turns around and says, what the fuck are the Pakis doing here? And Sadiq looks at Mukhtar and says, what the hell? You've woke me up at 5 in the morning. I'm super tired. I'm here to support these people. And they give me racism. What's wrong with you? And Mukhtar turns around and says, well, brother, we can see the bars and some of them can't. That just because some of these people have racist views doesn't mean that they're not being shafted, doesn't mean that they're not losing their industry. And just as the police are harassing us, just as we're being screwed over economically, so are these people. And we have to build bridges and unite people. And that's not easy. But there were people in those communities whose mindset shifted as a result of those actions. And, even during that strike, there were Asian women in Birmingham on strike. There was a factory called Kewell Brothers. It was like a sweatshop, right? And Asian women were on strike, and their boss was Asian. So Asian women against an Asian boss. And the miners from Nottingham, because they'd been supported by the Asians, they sent two coaches to Birmingham to support the Asian women. There's a great photo of it as well. So you've got white miners standing with Asian women against the Asian boss. And that took a lot of effort from both sides to build that kind of unity. Some people say it's impossible, that, we're culturally different, we'll never see eye to eye, even if we have the same material concerns. But I do think it is possible to at least try and build those connections, like I've seen it historically.
Taj, sticking with Birmingham, what did Malcolm X make of this all?
So Malcolm X had a massive influence on Asians. In the 60s...
His famous visit to Birmingham.
Yeah, he visited the UK on 4 occasions, actually. Not much is known about all his visits, but he spoke at the Oxford Union. He lectured at LSE. He came to Birmingham.
Went to Smethwick, yeah.
Yeah, he came to Birmingham, and I think there's an Indian restaurant. I think it was called... I forgot the name of it, but there's a picture of him with Asian students having kebabs, which is quite cool, from the 60s.
Yeah.
But he was a radical. He was saying to black people in America, don't settle for this. And he wasn't just advocating against racism. He was calling for reform within the community. He was saying, you guys have to be better organized. We're not outnumbered, we're out organized. And that assertiveness was something that a lot of people admired, because sometimes you would get people on these race relations committee and they're all talking about, it's all kumbaya and we'll all hold hands and we'll all make peace. And he was like, no, if you don't give us our peace, we'll demand it. And some people wanted that energy because of the racism that they were facing. And so, yeah, he visited Smethwick. I think the visit was coordinated by a woman called Claudia Jones and the Indian Workers Association. And just the year before his visit, he arrived in 1965 to Smethwick. The year before, there was a racist election campaign in Smethwick where they said, if you want an N-word for your neighbour, vote Labour.
Yeah.
And that election campaign is known as one of the most racist election campaigns in British history. And that street, Marshall Street, where Malcolm X is pictured, there's a photo of him. Malcolm went there. The Indian Workers Association said, we'll go with you. It's really rough here. The white people don't want us in this street. And he said, no, I'll go alone. And he got a lot of racist abuse. And one of the big activities of the Indian Workers Association at the time was challenging the colour bar. There were certain places where you couldn't go to a pub or club. Even certain barbers won't cut your hair. Even in the factories.
Was this segregation legal, like legal segregation, or was it socially, as in you just don't go there?
Oh, it was enforced like informally. It was only until like 1965 that you have, legislation outlawing discrimination. Even then, some people tried it in a kind of underhand way. But Malcolm X spent some time with these Asians, black people as well in the Midlands, and he drew the links between these different struggles in America and in Britain. And Avtar Singh Johal, who was a member of the Indian Workers Association at the time, said it was a shot in the arm of the anti-racist struggle. But even the guys that I was talking to you about, the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, the concept of self-defense is no offense, that we will fight the fascists. If you come to our neighborhood, we're going to fight you. This was like the second generation. These are young people who decide we're actually here to stay. The first generation said we'll make money and we'll go back. Second generation are born in Britain. They're facing racist bullying in schools. Back then you had this policy of busing where they wouldn't want too many black and Asian people in one area. So they would bus them out to a majority white school, and then they would get racist abuse in the majority white school. And young people saying, we've had enough. And so they looked to people like Malcolm X. They read, they listened to his recordings, and they were inspired by people like him. And so in Southall in 1976, you have the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chaggar, young Sikh lad who gets killed just outside the Dominion Cinema in Southall, which was the headquarters of the Indian Workers Association. And there's a guy called Suresh Grover. He's from Nelson. He'd been stabbed in Nelson when he was 13 by a racist, and he moved to Southall. And he sees a pool of blood the day after Gurdeep Singh Chaggar is murdered. And he says to the officer who's just in front of the police cordon, who's this pool of blood? What's this? And he says, it's just Asian blood. And Suresh is looking at him thinking, you're meant to protect us. Your job is to keep us safe. And there's so much racism in the police force. You're not going to protect us. And this youth of Southall said, we've had enough. We're going to organise the self-defence of our community. And so the Southall Youth Movement develops. In Brick Lane, East London, 1978, Taj Ali, a young textile worker, Bengali textile worker, is murdered. I think it's the election night when the National Front are standing in East London as well. Again, the Bengali youth movement is set up. They defend their community. They're working with the Southall Youth Movement. Up north, you've got the Bradford Asian Youth Movement, Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, Pendle Asian Youth Movement, Luton Asian Youth Movement, South as well. They're all coordinating. They're all, anti-racist. They're all organising. And again, they're all very class conscious. They're not just these vigilantes on the streets. They become very political. They're trying to understand colonialism, their history. They're talking about what's happening in Palestine. They're linking it to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. They send people to Belfast to support the Irish Republicans. So there is this really kind of rich history of young Asians, predominantly men, it's fair to say. I think you had an increase in migration of women from the 70s onwards, but they were male dominated. You start to see women's groups emerging as well in the 80s. But it was physical self-defense that defeated the far right.
Taj, what's the state of class consciousness today? You told that beautiful story about how we've got the Asians picketing with the white people in the mines. Today, you work a lot with the unions, or you speak a lot with the unions. What's class consciousness like today?
Overall, or just Asians?
Overall, and then between whites and ethnic minorities.
So this is an interesting one. When I was growing up in Luton, we were poor as well. And I remember for us, to be rich or to be poor was the difference between having Sky or having the 4 channels, or having like the branded products are going to like Lidl, or we used to go car boot sales, and non-uniform days when it will really hit you. There would be some kids who were like, yeah, we're all going to wear designer. I remember once they said...
Well, I forgot it was uniform day. That's why I have to wear my...
So they said to me, oh, what are you going to wear? I was like, I'm going to wear Armani jeans. And I remember I was wearing Primark jeans, and a guy was like, oh, where's the Armani? And I'm looking around for like, oh, I don't know where it's gone. And I knew guys that used to like draw a Nike tick on their trainers. That for us was what rich and poor meant. Even if we were all relatively quite poor compared to like richer parts, it was stuff like that. It was embarrassing.
It's like an innocent kind of like just on your clothes.
Yeah, but it was embarrassing to be poor. It wasn't a nice experience to have holes in your shoes and things like that. Like, it wasn't good. It's relative. Like, yeah, we were poor, but my dad had gone uni and he was on my case, and it meant educationally we were doing all right. and we're doing all right now, like in terms of my siblings' outcomes. But I think the class divide, we never spoke about class, right? The class divide only hit me when I was at uni, really. It was when I went to Warwick, and I'm studying history and politics. Very few Asians, especially working class Asians, studying history and politics. And I'm in my tutor group, and then one girl's like, "Oh yeah," they're asking, "What do you do over summer?" And one girl's like, "Yeah, I went on a skiing trip." Another guy's like, "Oh, I went to the safari." And they asked me, "What do you do?" I was like, "Oh, playing FIFA and like chilling with my mates in the park." Like genuinely, that's what I did. And you almost felt like, have I like done something wrong, kind of thing? Like, am I not one of these people? You felt that isolation, right? And you realize how well people are doing in life, and you see rich people and what their lives are like, and they've got parents who are doctors, they've got an uncle who's a lawyer, they're getting free, internships through family members. You're seeing that advantage that they have, and
You're seeing how far they are from you. As
yeah,
in life, we're all on this kind of like, it's this race, and we're all on this starting line, and you see how far
yeah,
they
they're
are
already ahead.
and where you are. And
Yeah.
you're like, I gotta catch up with them.
Yeah, and look, I don't hate on people for being wealthy. Like some of these people are nice people. They never chose their class background, right? They're born into wealth and privilege. But there were some people who would try and deny it. They would
Oh,
say
I
things
hated
like,
those.
"My dad worked hard to send me to private
Stop
school."
describing Ish.
No, but they would say,
Yeah.
"My dad worked hard," and I said, "Well, my dad worked hard. My dad worked in the factory. He worked as a cabbie. Then he had 3 heart attacks and a brain hemorrhage."
Yeah, the famous
that-
myth that like
Yeah.
hard work equals success
Yeah.
or being rich. Yeah.
So a lot of working class people work bloody hard, like work
Exactly.
extremely hard. I know people who work 2 jobs and they still struggle.
Like
to
working in
make
an
ends meet.
Amazon warehouse is not easy.
No, it's not. It's
It's
not.
backbreaking stuff.
I mean, Birmingham bin strikes at the moment. Everyone's panicking. Bin strikes. People look down on bin workers.
Oh, yeah.
But when they go on strike, you notice if politicians went on strike, it'd be business as usual. Let's be
I'll
honest.
give you an example. My mom's a care worker. She earns what, minimum wage?
Yeah.
She has to look after people who are mentally ill. They're threats to themselves and the people around her. The amount of time she's had to call the police because there's grown men fighting each other, and she, as a 5'4" Pakistani lady, what is she really gonna do? And when people say to me, "Oh, minimum wage jobs or like labor jobs or jobs associated with the working class are easy and these people are hardworking," clearly haven't sat in the room with them.
Yeah. So in terms of class consciousness, people associate this with like, Marxism and theory and all that. I wasn't reading these books to become left wing or class conscious, whatever you want to call it. It was my lived experience seeing the youth centres closing down, seeing the library hours being cut, and seeing the disadvantage in my community and comparing it to other places and saying this isn't right. Like, we need to invest in these communities. I think during that big strike wave, 2022, 2023, I was an industrial correspondent. So I was covering unions and strikes. And a lot of people are asking questions, what's a union? A lot of youngsters have not heard of trade unions. In the 70s, it was a big deal. Trade unions were very, very powerful. They could bring down governments. They could shut down like a lot of different industries. And then, the industry goes, unions associated with industry go, you have anti-union legislation. And I think class suddenly becomes less of a thing. People are talking about it less. We're talking more about identity politics and culture, and the discourse is about social mobility, right? It's about individuals. So it's not about a united class.
It's like you're ashamed to be working class, so be socially mobile and
Yeah.
leave the working class and go to the middle class.
Yeah.
It's this kind of embarrassment
It's a
to be
thing
part
to
of the working
escape from.
class. Exactly.
But in the 70s, it was a thing people were proud of. Why? I'll give you an example. If you worked as a miner, right? You knew you had a strong unionized job that can provide for your family. And you had a strong union. Anytime someone tried to screw you over, union would come in and fight your case. Very, very powerful trade unions. And so there was no shame in being a miner or being a firefighter or being a railway worker or a docker. It was like, yeah, I'm making decent money. It's hard work. I'm not trying to, downplay like how hard it is to work as a miner in all these places. But there was this sense that you had power as an individual, right? As a working class person, you have the power to change your life. When you lose that power and you don't have a union and you feel like you're being monitored and there's this surveillance and you've got 0-hour contracts, you suddenly feel like there isn't any power in being working class anymore. And I think the power has been lost during that big strike wave, it was in the conversation again. The unions are back, people are going on strike. So I think there was a bit of an increase there. But I still think overall, in Luton, for instance, most people would not say they are working class. Even though they might be, they won't identify with that. They're more likely to identify as, oh, I'm a Muslim, or I'm Pakistani, or I'm this and I'm that. And I think the far right, though, they've really adopted this concept of the white working class, the left behind. And that's problematic because it becomes a cultural thing where race is pitted against class rather than something that's bringing people together.
Is there any credence to that argument that the white working class have been left behind?
Well, we spoke earlier about, some of the disadvantages and how it manifests in multiple different ways, right? So when I went to Sixth Form College, there was a school called Stopsleys where Tommy Robinson went, predominantly white working class. Most of the boys from that school were not doing A-levels. They didn't have great employment outcomes. The Asian kids had better educational outcomes. So it's relative. We have some of the highest rates of child poverty in the UK in very diverse multicultural communities. Bangladeshi community has some of the highest rates of overcrowding when it comes to issues around housing. And so these things are complicated and nuanced, right? And it's our job to talk frank and openly about this, rather than saying, white people have got it easy, or you Asians are on all this, what do they call it, affirmative action, whatever, DEI stuff. Let's just be honest about the fact that the issue is that there are different levels of inequality in different parts of the country. And so there's not going to be one silver bullet that solves all of them. If you want to address geographic inequality, the fact that people in Bradford or the northeast of England or parts of Scotland, they don't access opportunity in London, how are you going to address that? That's the kind of frank and honest conversation that we need.
Yeah, so Taj, in the last few weeks, what we've seen is reform have absolutely swept through some of the local elections. We've seen Labour take a much harder stance on immigration with Keir Starmer's recent speech. How do you think these things are going to progress forward? Do you think there's a way to bridge those racial and ethnic divides with the class divides, or do you think it's going to be more polarised primarily along racial lines?
So the first thing to say is reform are doing particularly well in certain parts of the country. Coastal regions, Great Yarmouth, that's where Rupert Lau was elected. He's now being kicked out of reform. But Nigel Farage in Clacton, but also in the former mining communities, deindustrialised towns and cities, predominantly white working class areas. I'm thinking of places like Barnsley, parts of Wales as well, they're doing well. In the northeast of England, they're doing well. So you have to understand, who are the reform voters? What do they actually believe in? And the truth is, they're not a monolith. Yes, they have concerns about immigration, but a lot of them are in favour of nationalising key industries. And that's why you heard Reform going out and saying we want to nationalise the steel industry recently, right? Farage is one of the smartest politicians in Britain. He understands trade unions, he understands industry, he understands what makes voters tick, he understands how to use social media, and he's gripping people. Because Reform don't have any baggage, they've never been in government, people are so fed up with our two major parties that they're looking for an alternative, and he's selling them that. And so he's willing to adapt. This is the same guy who once campaigned for a statue of Margaret Thatcher in Trafalgar Square. He once said he was the only politician in Britain keeping the legacy of Thatcherism alive in Britain. The same Thatcherism that destroyed the mining communities in Barnsley and all these other places.
Deindustrialization, big push.
Privatized steel. Who privatized steel? And yet it's those same people that were screwed over by Thatcherism. They're voting for Farage. So he's played the game and he's done it very, very well. Now, if you look at the 2024 general election, Labour won 2/3 of the seats on what percentage of the vote? I think it was 34%, something like that. So their landslide majority was overstated. In the poorest parts of the country, their vote went backwards. 6.9% vote share decline in the poorest parts of Britain. So you also have the rise of independent candidates in the Muslim community as well, right? They take some of that vote share. The Greens in much metropolitan cities, they're taking some of that vote share. Reform in the post-industrial towns, in white working class towns, I think they're losing between 10 to 15%. Labour's losing 10 to 15% of their vote. So Labour's got this coalition and it's being, slowly eaten away at from different sections. The Lib Dems, people who wanted us to rejoin the EU, that was a big part of Keir Starmer's base. Don't forget, Keir Starmer was the man in 2019 as shadow Brexit secretary who was pushing Labour to have this second referendum policy. He was the guy pushing it. And if you look at some of his speeches from 2020, he's talking about freedom of movement. 5 years later, he's done a complete 360 and he's saying immigration, squalid chapter, incalculable damage. And people know this guy is disingenuous. If you want to cut immigration, why are you going to go for the person imitating Farage when you can get the real deal, right? And I think that's the fundamental problem, that people can see through this guy.
So on that speech that he gave where he called it an island of strangers, how bad was that speech? And do you think he's imitating Farage, or do you think he has this manifesto? I think, 90% of the UK are concerned about immigration. The amount of people that I speak to, British Asians that are concerned about immigration, it's a genuine grievance that people have, and he's trying to come up with some solutions. Where did he go wrong with that solution?
So just that speech itself, right? He talked about shutting down the lab, ending the experiment, a squalid chapter, an island of strangers.
It was like a mistake, essentially. Like
and Enoch Powell,
irreparable damage, stuff like that.
Yeah, and Enoch Powell, when he made that Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, he was saying they became strangers in their own land. So are you telling me it's a coincidence that they're using the same phrases on the same topic? Maybe it's a coincidence.
It has to be a coincidence. It can't be the idea that Keir Starmer sat there and took one of the most racist, vilified figure in British political history and was like, I'm going to copy this guy. I think that's absurd. It was definitely a mistake, like the wrong choice of words. But I don't think Keir Starmer, the Keir Starmer who supports human rights and like pro-immigration, took cues from Enoch Powell. I think that's like...
Well, clearly he's not written his own speech. I don't think he's ever written his own speech, right? But the point is, he was referring to an increase in immigration. When he says island of strangers, he's not talking about atomization. He's not talking about people on their phones on the tube. He's talking about immigration here. He's talking about an increase in immigration under the previous Conservative administration. Now, what led to that surge in immigration, that increase in immigration? It was the Ukraine resettlement scheme, the Hong Kong resettlement scheme, the Afghanistan resettlement scheme. That was huge. Then you have the backlog of international student visas just after COVID, right? Then you have the crisis in adult social care, where they have this visa scheme. And by the way, those people who came to work in social care, very exploited people, some of the most exploited in Britain. They're getting paid horrible wages. Their employers are threatening them with deportations if they don't do as they're told. So these migrant workers, 96% of them who followed the rules, right? They've come by legal means. I think often they're being conflated with these small boat crossings. When people think immigration, they're thinking, oh, small boat crossings. And we've had for so many years, stop the boats. It's been constantly, everything you hear from Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister talking about it, having it on his lectern, in the newspapers, GB News, Talk TV. Everywhere you go, you're hearing about anti-migrant sentiment. It's in your faces. I think that's played a massive role in people's concerns. I don't think that there's no legitimate concerns about immigration. I don't think having concern about immigration makes you racist. But let's be honest about the fact that this has been a constant discussion point in our media class, in our political class, and it's always been there. After the Windrush docked in Britain, you had Labour MPs complaining to Clement Attlee there's going to be a problem of cohesion and integration. After the racist riots in 1958 in Nottingham and Notting Hill, where West Indians are being attacked, people are saying, the local Labour MPs are saying, yeah, we've got this problem of immigration. Even when the numbers are small, there's this concern of immigration. And so be honest about the fact that we have structural economic problems in this country where we've not invested in skills and training. We've not invested in improving pay and conditions in the NHS, in social care and construction. And these workers have come in to fill those shortages. If you don't want them coming here, fix the problem. Do you know what that will mean? It will mean billions of pounds of government spending. And nobody wants to have that conversation.
Yeah, Taj, I completely understand sort of what you're saying. Obviously, there's a massive number of people that came through. There's a lot of the backlogs and stuff like that. But people will still say that, you know, how many of these people are working in the care? Because in the care sector, you come in, you can bring a whole bunch of dependents as well, and that puts a massive.
They've cut down on that.
They've cut down on that now, but that's obviously one of the issues that people had, where it's not just individual care workers coming; it's care workers and maybe their parents and maybe their kids and their entire families. And when you have, let's say, 1.3 million people in a single year coming into the country, that's bound to cause some sort of friction and some sort of problem. And it's it's not completely unfair to say, if people are worried about immigration, that in a democracy they should be allowed to voice that and maybe express that politically as well. No.
So I think the thing to understand is it's in areas where you have low levels of migration, where you have higher concern about immigration. And we need to try and understand this a bit. And a lot of these places I mentioned earlier, predominantly white working class areas, lost their industry, lost their community, lost their social infrastructure, your pubs, your parks, your areas of social interaction. And it's interesting, when I've been to Great Yarmouth, where Rupert Lau was elected, very few immigrants there, right? But because they have such bad substandard accommodation, they spend time congregating in the high street. And so local people if you look at the state of seaside towns at the moment, they're not like what they were in the 70s. They've been impacted by, package holidays and all the rest. They're seeing a few black and Asian faces and they think there's a big problem here because it's so visible and in their face, right? They're in the town centre. And so I think sometimes some of that is amplified. And what they're doing is they're looking at economic insecurities that people have, this sense that they've lost so much, and they're linking it to an increase in migration at the same time, right? In terms of this concern about the numbers and the infrastructure, I do think we have a problem of infrastructure. I don't think we have enough houses. We've not built enough social housing since the 1960s. But here's where the dilemma comes in. The government have pledged to build 1.5 million homes over the next parliament. The construction industry says we need to recruit 250,000 workers if the government wants to meet their target. Currently in the construction industry, they're losing 70,000 workers a day because most of the construction workers, the British construction workers, are over the age of 50, right? The government's going to train up, they've said, about 60,000 workers. That's going to take a few years. Then you need to get experience on the job to do the work. So even to build these homes, to alleviate potential concerns around the housing crisis, right, which is always a big one. We don't have enough houses for everyone. They're going to rely on migrant workers. So the only way you can decrease the number of migrants coming to Britain is to fix the problem in the economy. The government have just announced a 6% cut to the adult skills budget. What do you think that's going to do to upskilling people in Britain to do those jobs? And so what frustrates me about this conversation is just disingenuous. You can't keep pointing the finger at migrants who are filling the labour shortages that you've created by underpaying NHS workers. By the way, the resident doctors in the British Medical Association are currently being balloted on strike action, right? Nurses want a higher pay rise. They're talking about strike action. The care sector is a joke in terms of, how hard it is and the money. Why would British people want to work in these sectors? British doctors are going to Qatar and Australia and New Zealand and other places because they're getting paid more.
Is that not a way to undercut sort of native British workers though? Because let's say there's a low wage, let's say for nurses, for doctors, that sort of stuff, and a British person is from here is like, no, I don't have that desperation where I can fight and sort of try and get a higher wage, whereas someone has come thousands of miles, they're desperate, they just want to be in the country, they'll work for those low wages, they'll work like a dog just because they're grateful.
Isn't that a classic left-wing argument in that by bringing so many migrants, you undercut wages? And
And I've got friends actually that work for the NHS that have said that actually a lot of the locum shifts that they used to rely on that actually supported them a lot. They've been going now because you've had these migrant sort of workers that are coming over. They're able to work for less, and it gives the workers that are British workers less negotiating power and less actual buying power.
I mean, this is a classic argument, right? And it was the argument that people used when the seafarers were working on the ships. They were being paid less, Alaska seafarers. And the union of seafarers at the time was saying, you need to stop hiring these people, right? Even though there's a labour shortage, you need to stop hiring these people. When there were racist riots in 1919 after the First World War in the port cities of Liverpool and Cardiff, where people were being pelted with stones and things like that, Arabs and Asians and Chinese people, it was economic uncertainty. It was almost like we're getting into the Depression years, right? The Trades Union Congress put out a motion condemning Asiatic labour, again on that basis that these people are undercutting those workers. The way to deal with this problem is to have proper regulation in the economy, to have a certain standard. And we used to have sectoral collective bargaining, right? Where in certain sectors, and they're going to bring this in for social care, by the way, the initial pledge from the Labour government, with pressure from the unions, was to have it rolled out in other sectors of economy. You've got a minimum standard which works for everyone. And I think that's the way forward. Now, it is an argument and it is a concern, right? And I've seen it at Amazon, right? This is a good example. I was covering the unionization activity of Amazon workers. Most of them were migrants. And they were getting so close to reaching the ballot for union recognition. And then the employers had hired some Indian workers and said to them, you better not join the union. And they were unable to win unionization. So it is a concern and it is an argument that is made. But again, in certain industries where you've had this history of migrant workers, it's funny because even some of these trade unionists who were against Asian workers and Arab workers were the descendants of Irish migrants. And again, it was that cycle when the Irish migrants came and they built the canals and they helped build the railways. There was the same sentiment against those workers, and they helped establish some of these unions in the first place. The question to ask is, if there are Nigerians or Indians or Pakistanis or others who are desperate for work, at what point do we decide that it's only going to be the English workers that we care about, if that makes sense? So where does the
I think it's less
empathy
English,
stop?
more British. Like,
Yeah.
it isn't just they're white English. We're going to give them, it's more they're British, they were born here, they have a British passport, and therefore we should prioritize them over. Obviously, it's not an argument that
So-
I
so-
believe, but I'm just
So
trying to give
let me ask you
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I'm not trying to steel man the argument. It's
Yeah.
British, as in, and I'll
Yeah.
give you an example, right? When you talk about immigration, people kind of caricature it and like, oh, it's only white racist reform voters. That isn't the case. Anecdotally, for me,
Yeah.
I've spoken to so many Black British, Asian British people, and they've also shared concerns about immigration. If I went to Small Heath,
Yeah.
they'd be talking about the Albanians coming, the Romanians coming.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of like it's like a British thing where British people who are second, third, fourth generation
Yeah.
immigrants are looking at the people coming across and
Yeah.
like feeling threatened for their security.
It's always been that way. In 1895, there was an Asian MP elected in Bethnal Green on an anti-Jewish immigrant slogan. 1895, you got an Asian elected in East London, and part of his argument is we need to stop these Jews fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe coming here, right? It's always been there. I mean, Tommy Robinson has an Irish background, English Defence League. He's Irish, right? So it's always been there. And again,
Isn't the head of reform Pakistani?
Oh,
Zia
he's Sri
Yusuf.
Lankan, Zia
Yeah.
Yusuf. Yeah.
but it's always been there. And look, Luton voted Brexit.
But again, you're like, Taj, you're comparing genuine grievances people have with extreme cases of like stopping Jews come from the pogroms.
Yeah.
There's people, average British citizens, who are concerned genuinely, they have genuine grievances. I don't think we need to like put it extreme and say we have this example. People are going to be concerned about immigration even if immigration isn't a problem. That's what they're hearing on the radio. They're hearing something to be concerned about.
Of course.
And so what are the genuine things we can do to limit it or to kind of keep their standard of living like high, or just deal with this kind of grievance or security issue they have?
I mean, Luton, Birmingham, Bradford, I think voted leave as well. I heard it from Pakistani people. They were saying things like, there's too many Eastern Europeans, there's too many Polish, there's too many Romanians. Again, when you work, I've worked in some of these places, in the warehouse. When I left Warwick, I worked at this bread factory. Most of the workers were migrant workers. There were very few British workers. And again, it was because the work was tough. It was 12-hour night shifts. Your toes are hurting at the end of the night. You've got back pain afterwards. Until you address these problems in terms of workers' rights, in terms of improving pay and conditions, you're not going to solve the problem. You have to address structural issues in the economy. It's that simple. But again, I still believe that Britain, a nation that colonized a quarter of the world, right? A nation that's been involved in the destabilization of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, also has an obligation on the international stage to support refugees. I don't think everything should be confined to economic value. I think we should have some humanity, right? That doesn't mean I believe in open borders. I believe a state should have control of its borders. You have to have the investment in infrastructure. And all of these things come down to a simple principle, which is financial investment, right? How much money is the government willing to put in? When they say they back British workers, where's the income? Where's the funding? Where's the investment?
So Taj, you've laid out like sort of quite a good plan potentially moving forward for how this country can heal and get past these issues. Do you think the Labour Party is the party to do that for us?
Not in its present form, I don't think so, because I think they're tied to these fiscal rules, right? Rachel Reeves is talking about, oh, we need to stick to the fiscal rules. They're not willing to raise the revenue. They're not willing to do the tax reform. We're getting this narrative of anti-migrant sentiment at the same time. We're hearing, they've cut the winter fuel payment. The amount of times that was brought up in Runcorn, where Reform have won, the welfare cuts and things like that. There's no ambition there. There's no real structural change to the economy. It's tinkering around the edges. So I don't think they're going to make much change. I think they've kind of, when they say they're not going to increase taxes or they're not going to increase borrowing, based on where we are now as an economy with an aging population and everything else, that means they're probably likely to make further spending cuts. And I think that's going to be disastrous for the Labour Party.
Taj, on that note, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.